Welcome everyone to the July Walk Massachusetts Network meeting. I'm gonna send it over to our speaker now. Rounaq, on to you.
Thanks, Brendan. Can everyone see my screen? Yeah, okay, cool. Let me just get these meeting controls out of the way. All right, I'm very excited to be here. Presenting at the network meeting and sharing some of the work that I've been doing over the last couple of years with you. Today, I'll be touching upon a couple of different themes in my talk. One is to understand pedestrian behavior, and the other is about creating analytic tools that help planning and policy for pedestrians. And I'll introduce myself in just a little bit. So just to set the agenda for the talk, I'll introduce myself. I'm familiar with some of you in the audience, but for the others, providing a bit of background about my work and my interests and where I'm working right now. And I'll try to motivate this talk by talking about why it's so important for us to focus on understanding pedestrians and why it relates to so many other lived experiences beyond transportation, other urban systems that we engage with when we live in a city. And then I'll share some of the research that we have been doing on understanding pedestrian behavior and creating a framework to help planning and policy decisions. We've tested that framework out in different parts of the world, both locally as well as internationally. And I'll show case studies from Melbourne, Beirut, and Beirut, Lebanon, and Somerville. So who am I? I identify as a plan engineer. I have degrees in transportation engineering and planning, and I graduated with a PhD in urban science and planning last year. And since then, I've been working at MIT as a postdoc. And very recently, just earlier this month, I started at the Boston Region MPO, which stands for Metropolitan Planning Organization, as the manager of multimodal planning and design. And I'm also one of the new board members at WalkMass, Massachusetts. So as you can see, my interests lie in trying to connect research, policy and practice and advocacy and aim for reducing auto dependence and thinking more about sustainable modes of transportation. And I've had the privilege and pleasure of traveling the world and staying and working in many of these places, mostly internationally, but also quite a few within the country over the last 10 years or so. So with that, I'll jump right in. Here's a picture I had taken in Maine earlier this year when I was there, and I thought it was really funny. It's a bit of a cliff walk, I guess you could call it, and they had the sign. They had multiple signs actually calling out bikers and e-scooter users, and they wanted to make sure that only pedestrians had access to those spots. It's unfortunate that we don't see a sign like this in our cities. So talking about cities and our society at large, I view the two major challenges that we face collectively as climate change and social inequality. And when we think about climate change and social inequality, one of the major sectors that contributes to these two themes is the transportation sector. When we look at greenhouse gas emissions, both globally as well as within the US, transportation contributes to almost 1/3 of the total greenhouse gas emissions. And within the transportation sector, the lion's share of greenhouse gas emissions are coming from light-duty vehicles. So these are private vehicles that are owned and operated by people to move around, which is separate from freight or rail or aircraft. And there's an opportunity to rethink this, especially after the pandemic and in response to rising inflation. President Biden has been allocating a significant chunk of federal dollars to improve infrastructure, especially focusing more on sustainable infrastructure. Unfortunately, what happens is that funding is being funneled into electric vehicle programs and policies that are being highlighted as perhaps the only way to get to a sustainable mobility future. But the risk with doing that is that we are missing out on emphasizing so many of the other policy levers at our disposal, right? So we have all of these tried and tested means of thinking about ways beyond cars that people use to move around. So we have walking, biking, public transportation, and even parking policies that could help us reduce auto dependence. And from an emissions point of view, as we can see over here, when we look at the emissions by different modes of transportation, it's an easy sell why we should be prioritizing walking and biking. But beyond simply emissions, our lack of emphasis to provide safe infrastructure and safe environments for pedestrians has led to a public health crisis. When we compare the US to other OECD countries, and we can see this over several decades, the US unfortunately has been experiencing a much higher rate of road fatalities compared to its counterparts. And this has been particularly impacted by the pandemic, as you can see the uptick in both these trends for the US post-2020. And there's a crash report that Brendan and others at Walk Massachusetts have put together that you could refer to on the website that talks about how the number as well as the rate of road fatalities has been rising over the last few years. In addition to that, there's also an issue about equity and injustice. So when we look at the pedestrian fatality rates, or more generally pedestrian danger by race and ethnicity, so we can clearly see that historically marginalized communities, racial minorities in particular, are much more likely to experience a higher level of pedestrian danger as compared to the national average. And there's also another element to the equity piece. When we think about households with and without cars and compare how they move about the city, we can see that for households without cars, half of their trips are made by walking or biking. So we would be doing them a grave disservice if we did not provide enough and adequate supportive walking and biking infrastructure, which we do not seem to be doing at the moment. And this also plugs into other policies around Vision Zero, for example, which tries to eliminate traffic deaths and injuries, but also the Safe Routes to School policy, which advocates for safe routes for children to walk to their schools. And that's something which some of us may have experienced as children growing up, but is certainly not the case now, where we see a greater propensity of children getting dropped off to school by their parents in a private car, as opposed to them walking or playing in the streets. And in the US in particular, we see that there is great potential to induce what's known as a mode shift, to shift people away from using private cars to walking and biking, for instance. So almost half of the car trips are less than 3 miles long. So for those who are able and willing, we have the potential to shift them away from cars to more sustainable modes of transportation, especially for these short trips, if we can provide the appropriate infrastructure and environment. And this connects, again, more holistically as a society to the Sustainable Development Goals, one of which is our commitment to make cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. And pedestrians are at the heart and center of this sort of a commitment. So with that, I'll transition to the first project that I want to share with you, which is about understanding pedestrian behavior. And when I talk about pedestrian behavior, it's about trying to understand pedestrian route choice behavior in particular. So what influences our decision to walk along a certain route? Why do we prefer to walk along certain sidewalks as opposed to others, or one side of the road as opposed to the other side of the road? Well, there could be a lot of factors influencing these decisions. The first is simply the availability of pedestrian infrastructure. Is there a sidewalk? How wide is the sidewalk? Are there crosswalks? How many turns do I have to take to get to my destination, and so on? There's also the element of the pedestrian experience. So is the route interesting? Does it have shade? Does it have greenery? Is it pleasant? Are there amenities or storefronts that I can pass by that make my experience much more memorable? Then there are natural environmental factors such as climate and how comfortable that place feels, the terrain or the elevation, and so on. And then there are subjective factors such as safety, comfort, familiarity with the neighborhood, and noise levels, which all of us have different tolerance levels for these sorts of subjective factors. So what we did was trying to understand pedestrian route choice at scale. In the past, people have conducted surveys to understand pedestrian route choice. One way of collecting data has been simply to ask people about what factors go into their decision making. The other way people have collected data in the past is through something known as a stated preference survey, where some hypothetical alternatives were provided to people and they had to rank or rate them or choose between them. And then using some statistical modeling techniques, researchers have been able to infer the importance of different factors that go into the route choice decision making. But what we wanted to focus on was something at scale. So when we go out and ask people, which is certainly important, but that requires time and funding, and both of these are hard to come by. So what we wanted to do to supplement those previous studies was to use anonymous GPS data, which was large enough for us to be able to infer these behaviors at scale. So we tried to estimate how different street attributes affected pedestrian route choice preferences, and then we operationalized those effects as willingness to walk measures. And I'll explain what that is in just a little bit. And these measures can be plugged in directly into policy and planning evaluations, into infrastructure decisions, and so on. And we did this for two cities, Boston and San Francisco, using the same data source and the same modeling framework, which allowed us to compare effects between the two cities, which is also something that has rarely been done with the survey sample-based approach. So when we look at our two study areas, San Francisco and Boston, after cleaning the data sets, we had more than 10,000 observations in each city, and we have a fairly good representation, less so in Boston than in San Francisco, but this data covers a year's worth of walking trips from May 2014 to May 2015. And in order to explain why people were walking along these routes, we tested a bunch of different explanatory variables. So drawing on the literature, we have our usual suspects, such as route length. So longer the route, less likely is it that people are going to walk along that route, the number of turns, the elevation along the route, the number of amenities people pass by when they're walking along the route, the width of the sidewalk, exposure to car traffic, especially along highways, the traffic speed along the roads, as well as the traffic volume. And in addition to these, we wanted to add a couple of so-called modern variables, which are somewhat computationally intensive, but are available to us because of big data. So one is the sky view factor, and the other is the green view index. And despite these big names, they simply represent the exposure to an open sky or the exposure to greenery as people are walking along the route. And we were able to measure these variables using Google Street View images. As you can see over here, we walked along those routes that people had taken in our data set using Google Street View, and we were able to capture these snapshots, and using computer vision models, we were able to understand, as you can see on the rightmost column, the percent of someone's view that was occupied by the sky or by any sort of greenery. To summarize, we found pretty consistent results. We found that route length has a negative effect. So yes, indeed, people avoid longer routes. People also avoid taking too many turns. So they like to get from their origin to their destination by minimizing the number of turns if possible. People also don't like walking along elevated routes. If there's a huge elevation gain along the route and you have to walk up a hilly stretch, that doesn't seem to be preferable. And people generally like routes that are buffered from cars. So routes that pass by highways with high traffic speeds and a large volume of traffic are not preferred. On the other hand, if you have wider sidewalks or more amenities and storefronts along the street, as well as more greenery, we saw that there was a positive effect of these factors on pedestrian route choice. And the open air exposure was somewhat mixed. We saw that pedestrians in Boston really liked routes that were more exposed to the sky as opposed to San Francisco. And then we wanted to take these effects and create something that was meaningful for policymaking. So in a lot of infrastructure investment decisions and in project evaluation, there's this measure that's used, especially in the transportation world, that's known as the value of travel time. And the way it works is it's also known as willingness to pay, or WTP. So let's say that the value of travel time is 25 cents per minute. So what that means is individuals are willing to pay 25 cents extra to reduce travel time by 1 minute. And this sort of measure is really useful in financing transit improvement projects, for example. So we wanted to create something equivalent to this that we called the willingness to walk, or the equivalent walking distance. And we provide this example. So let's say the equivalent walking distance for turns is 25 meters. So that means that to avoid one extra turn, individuals are willing to walk 25 extra meters. So we can estimate these willingness to walk effects for all of the different variables that I just mentioned earlier. And we can see that over here. I've plotted them out. Red represents the willingness to walk measures for Boston. Blue represents San Francisco. And we can see, for example, that reducing one turn would increase the willingness to walk, or increasing the number of turns rather, would reduce the willingness to walk much more in San Francisco than in Boston. Similarly, if we just focus on Boston, then increasing the number of amenities would increase the willingness to walk. So would the sky view factor. With the green view index, looking at the range, we didn't find it to be statistically significant. The city of Boston has traffic speed limits, so that again did not come out to be statistically significant. But for traffic volume, we did see a negative effect. So if there's a higher volume of traffic along a certain route, then the willingness to walk reduces by about, I would say this is 8 meters or so. So how does this translate into walking to certain destinations? So the way we think about this is in an accessibility framework, and the way transportation researchers and planners talk about accessibility is twofold. One relates to the ADA Act, of course, but the other way of thinking about accessibility is access to different types of destinations. Can I get there? Is it convenient? Can I get there within a certain amount of time or cost and so on? So the way to do this is to construct catchment areas, also known as walksheds, because we're focusing on pedestrians, around different points of interest. And these points of interest are usually public utilities, such as, or public services, such as public transport stations or schools or parks or libraries and so on. The simplest way to do this is to just draw a circle around that point of interest. So let's assume that we want to talk about a mile as our buffer radius for the walkshed. So we would just assume a radius of 1 mile, draw a circle. That's the Euclidean distance walkshed. But something a little more nuanced is to think about the actual network that people are walking on. So we can't fly as the crow flies for 1 mile, right? We have to walk along the pedestrian network. So that gets us, using the network distance, gets us into something a bit more jagged, as you can see in the middle graphic over here. That's the network walkshed. And that almost always is less than or smaller than the Euclidean walkshed, because you have to traverse along the network, and that requires that you wouldn't be able to get as far within 1 mile as you would as if you were to move as the crow flies. And then using all of these behavioral effects that we just estimated, these willingness to walk measures, if we bake those into the accessibility framework, then we can think about what's known as perceived distance, where you might be walking for 1 mile along the pedestrian network, but because of the turns or because of exposure to traffic or walking along certain storefronts, so you could have positive or negative perceptive effects, and that would change the perceived distance in a pedestrian's mind, but not necessarily the network distance. And that gets us to the much smaller perceived walkshed. And we looked at this for transit stations in both San Francisco and Boston. These are some transit walksheds around BART stations in San Francisco. And what we found that is the perceived walkshed is always smaller than the objective walkshed, and using the network distance. In downtown, it's not as bad. The perceived walkshed is around 60% of the objective walkshed, but in other areas, it's about a third. And we noticed the same thing in Boston as well. So looking at the commuter rail stations in Boston, we found that the perceived walksheds were less than half of the objective walksheds. So this really speaks to the need and importance of incorporating these behavioral factors into not just constructing walksheds, but also thinking more broadly about policy measures to help pedestrian planning and trying to do this in a more behaviorally consistent manner than assuming that people just walk along the network and everyone's thinking homogeneously, and there's not enough variation within the needs and preferences of different pedestrians. This is ongoing research, but I really wanted to share this with you. These are fresh results. I'm happy to take questions about these earlier. Something that perplexed me personally was that the Green View Index was not showing up as significant for Boston. So the question naturally arises, do pedestrians really not care about greenery? So the data doesn't seem to support what we know from our lived experiences. And the answer is they do. They do. So as it turns out, we were using Google Street View images to estimate exposure to greenery, and they are misleading because they're almost always from nice days, which are bright and sunny, and they don't really represent seasonal variation and so on. So using satellite images, a colleague and I computed a greenery index known as the NDVI, and that can be separated for the 2 seasons, summer and winter. And we found that pedestrians like greener routes during summer, but not during winter. And these effects were now coming out to be statistically significant. And the other question that we've been probing is about the effect of heat on pedestrian route choice. And it ties in very well to some of the efforts that Walk Massachusetts has been doing. This is either Yolanda or Brendan earlier this week, or perhaps last week, where they were walking around in Worcester with a thermal gun. And you can see this is a 10-second video. So within 7 seconds on the same sidewalk, there's a 16-degree Fahrenheit difference in the measured temperature. That's a 10 degrees Celsius difference in 7 seconds of walking along the same sidewalk at 11 a.m. in Worcester. So the way to think about this is not just about the temperature, but more broadly, bringing in other factors such as the radiation, the humidity, the wind, and so on. And folks have come up with an index, which is known as the Universal Thermal Climate Index, or the Comfort Index, UTCI. So we incorporated UTCI as another explanatory variable, and we looked only at summer trips in Boston. Again, this is data from, this is somewhat dated data from 2014-15, and we found that their UTCI didn't always matter. So sometimes pedestrians did not have meaningfully different alternatives, meaning that the average heat index along the different alternatives that were available to them when they were thinking about walking from their origin to their destination were roughly the same. But in cases where they had a cooler alternative available, that's when UTCI started to matter. And we found that the average willingness to walk is 11 meters per degree Celsius. So in our video example, where the temperature difference was 10 degrees Celsius, that's 110 meters. And in our data, the average route length for pedestrians is 636 meters, which means that for this 10 degrees Celsius difference in temperature, people are going to walk 17% less on average. That's a significant finding. Again, these are just preliminary results that we're starting to dive deeper into, and I'd be happy to take more questions on these later on. So that with that, I'd like to transition to the second part of the presentation, where we use some of the behavioral research that we have been doing to create analytic tools and frameworks to directly aid planning and policy around pedestrians. For some of us who are familiar with the environmental review process, we know that anytime there's a new development that comes up, we have to do a traffic impact assessment. Developers are required to do that by law. What that means is they have to estimate the changes in car traffic that the new development is going to cause in its surroundings. But there isn't any equivalent legislation around pedestrian impact assessments. So let's say a developer were to demonstrate that they have put in supporting infrastructure and they would generate far more pedestrian trips than was there earlier, and they would also reduce the number of car trips in that area, then perhaps they could unlock some incentives to fund those types of infrastructure investments. Additionally, there's also, when we think about Vision Zero, there's the curious case of the missing denominator. MassDOT has a crash portal, as do many other agencies, not just in the country, but also internationally. These portals record data on where crashes occurred and how many crashes occurred. But we don't know how many people were walking there in the first place. So that's the missing denominator. We don't know the incidence rate. So let's say we have two locations, one where we have 50 people walking and the other where we have 500 people walking. And there are 5 crashes in both those intersections. So with limited resources, which one should be prioritized for improving safety? 5 out of 50 or 5 out of 500? So that's the contribution of this sort of framework, where we try to provide better data for more informed policy decision-making. So this is something that we are working on in a broader team effort. So we have 3 components to this framework that we're calling US Walks. The first part is about creating pedestrian networks. So a lot of times we simply don't have any good data on pedestrian networks. People make assumptions about where people walk, so that sometimes means that the road network is used in lieu of the pedestrian network because the data isn't available. Sometimes OpenStreetMap does provide some data on pedestrian networks, but again, that's voluntarily sourced. There aren't good quality checks, and the data quality can be lacking. So we have come up with a way to create pedestrian networks using computer vision models and aerial imagery. If there are networks available, we can directly use them, such as we are doing in New York City. But in other cases, we often have to generate our own networks. Once we have those networks and we know the different attributes for each sidewalk, such as the amenities, the sidewalk width, tree cover, highway proximity, and so on, basically factors that influence pedestrian route choice, we have a framework to estimate the number of people walking along each segment in that network, and that's PedFlows. And finally, we're hoping to share all of this data in an open source manner, where you can visualize different parts of the network, compare different areas within the same city or even different cities in the US through our data infrastructure platform that we're calling PedViz. So this is in the early stages in terms of scaling this up to multiple cities in the US, but we have demonstrated the application of this framework in the 3 case studies that I mentioned, and I'll just go over those. I'll skip this in the interest of time, but PedFlows essentially collects data on different points of interest. based on the origins and destinations of where people might walk. And this is very contextual, depending on which city or which area you're looking at. We have a flow estimation process where we generate the number of people walking along different routes from the origin to the destination. That also incorporates some of the behavioral preferences we saw earlier. And if there are pedestrian counts available to us at particular locations, then we can calibrate this model and get coefficients for the different trip types and have trip generation rates. And finally, we can use that to predict flows, not just along the segments, but also to do some scenario modeling, as I'll show quickly. So the first case study is that of Melbourne. Melbourne has automated pedestrian sensors. They've been collecting this data for a long time, pretty close to a decade. And in addition to that, they have annual census data on land use and employment. And we combine these two data sets with weather data. And we went through our flow estimation process. As you can see over here, we look at the different origins and destinations that people might walk to and from. And because we had data throughout the day, we could look at 3 different travel periods. So the morning peak, lunchtime, as well as the evening peak. And we know, again, from our own lived experiences that people conduct different types of trips at different times of the day. For example, in the morning, you might be walking to work, and during the lunchtime peak, you might be visiting nearby stores from your workplace, and then in the evening, you might stop by the park or the grocery store on your way back home. So we do have the ability to consider different flows for different travel periods, and then because we also have the pedestrian count data, we can calibrate our model, and as you can see, we can understand which types of trips are much more prominent during different times of the day. And using that, just from point locations of the pedestrian counts, we can predict the flows along every single segment in the pedestrian network. And this is the predicted morning peak foot traffic in Melbourne. And we can also do scenario modeling. So what we did was we calibrated the model for 2014, and we tracked the change in land use between 2014 and 2015. So we looked at where the number of residents or jobs were increasing or decreasing, and we've shown that over here. And as a result of that, we predicted the change in the foot traffic during the AM peak between 2014 and 15 for every segment. And we also had data for 2015, so we were able to validate our model as well. Moving on to Beirut, this was a really great opportunity for us to contribute to real-time decision-making. Some of you may be aware that there was an explosion in the Beirut port in 2020, and a lot of neighborhoods around the port were affected as a result of these blasts. So we were working on this project with the American University of Beirut. It's called Beirut Community Streets. It was to try and figure out ways to improve the walkability in these blast-affected neighborhoods, working with communities and residents and stakeholders over there in Beirut. So some of the challenges that you see in the pedestrian network are not too different from what we see here in Massachusetts. You have to navigate quite a lot of obstacles. The sidewalk width suddenly changes and becomes super narrow. And these are challenges not just for able-bodied pedestrians, but also for those who have different mobility needs. And unlike Melbourne, we did not have any automated data collection mechanism. So we had to collect data the old-fashioned way. We had a team of students stand at different intersections and collect data throughout the day. And then we translated those pedestrian counts to pedestrian flows using the framework that I had mentioned earlier. And you can see over here that certain neighborhoods kind of pop up as having high pedestrian flows during the weekday evening peak. And we work with stakeholders to co-design scenarios of pedestrian improvement. So we had workshops and discussion sessions and so on, where we sketched out particular interventions that would help improve pedestrian walkability and accessibility. And then we engaged in scenario modeling, where we brought those back, incorporated those interventions into our model, and we were able to estimate the pedestrian volume changes from the baseline to any particular intervention. And finally, I want to share again new research that we're doing very close to home in Somerville, Massachusetts. I'm sure everyone's aware that we've finally had our Green Line extension, as you can see from these delighted faces of first-time riders. This has been a long time coming and very appreciated by residents, but that also leads to some planning challenges. The estimated ridership daily is going to be around 50,000 by 2030, and now almost 85% of Somerville residents live within walking distance of rapid transit. So we are hoping that more and more folks are going to be using the Green Line extension. But as we hope for that, we also have to look out for some questions around how they're going to access those Green Line stations. And as these neighborhoods develop and unfortunately gentrify, how will the proposed developments affect pedestrian flows? So the city of Somerville has been collecting doing pedestrian counts annually since 2010. They're available both in the morning and in the evening peaks. And you can see some of the locations where they do pedestrian counts. And we looked at 2019 as our baseline. So again, using that framework that I mentioned earlier, we were able to translate these pedestrian counts to pedestrian flows. And you can really see the difference here, where we had counts at only certain locations, but now we were able to expand this to every single segment in the network. And we were able to look at what's happening in the walksheds of particular GLX stations. This is Union Square. We were able to identify segments where there was high foot traffic volume, and also try to estimate the impacts of these proposed redevelopments happening around not just Union Square, but some of the other GLX stations as well. And we can see over here, like, these are the segments where there's going to be an increased foot traffic or decreased foot traffic, and what might the city of Somerville want to do to support this sort of pedestrian flow increase. We can also identify frustration points where putting in a new footbridge or a crosswalk would really help connectivity to the GLX station. We have published some of this work in some journals, academic journals, and we're working on doing the same for the others. This was a group effort. All of this work has been done over the last few years with my colleagues and Professor Andres Sepsuk at the City Farm Lab. With that, I'd like to thank you and field questions.
Great, thanks so much. I'm going to just stop the recording.